So it just so happens that those texts are a special interest of mine. And I could do a course. I could do a course on those early fathers. In fact, I have to confess to you all that I'm supposed to be writing a commentary on First Clement for the Hermeneia series at Fortress Press. The challenge for me is that First Clement is 65 chapters long. It's one of the longest writings in early Christian literature. And so even though I've been working on it for several years, I'm a long ways from being finished. I need a sabbatical.
I can predict right now, Larry, how that commentary is going to look. The first 3 or 4 chapters are going to be 18 pages long each.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And it's intimidating because the standard that is demanded for those Hermeneia commentaries, the standard was set by the great old Lutheran scholar at Harvard, Helmut Kester. And he told me, like he tells the other authors, that a commentary produced for the Hermeneia is expected to last for more than 100 years. Well, I see our time has come. Shall we get started? Very good. I'm so grateful to everyone for returning for the last installment of our course on the mystery of death and the meaning of resurrection. And today, I have prepared for our consideration, with the help of one of our colleagues, Mr. Beckman, who is responsible for one of those texts. I have prepared 3 texts for us to explore. They are texts of the late 1st and the 2nd century. So later than the Gospels, for the most part, and later than the letters of Paul. So let's get started. I want, before we get started, I should say one more thing. What these texts clearly illustrate is that the subject of the resurrection, what is the resurrection? In what form will it occur? What should we hope for? It is clear that that subject continued to fascinate Christians throughout the 2nd century. So with that in mind, let's look at the first of our 3 texts. It is called the Treatise on the Resurrection. It was discovered buried in the sand of Egypt, outside a little village called Nag Hammadi. So it is part of a buried library. And the Treatise on the Resurrection is found in the first codex at Nag Hammadi. It is also sometimes referred to as the Epistle to Reginos. And that is because, as you can see from the beginning of it, it takes the form of a letter to a young Christian who very clearly has questions about the resurrection. Now, the text that was discovered buried in the sand in Egypt is written in the Coptic language. So that is the Egyptian language written in a Greek alphabet. And experts on the Nag Hammadi library date the treatise on the resurrection, the copy that we have, the Coptic text, they date that text to the 4th century. But it is clear that the Coptic is a translation of an older Greek text, which was probably written about the middle of the 2nd century. So this is an old writing. It is pretty clear that the text was written by a leader of the Valentinian Christians, a group that was regarded as Gnostic by the early church fathers. In fact, some scholars believe that the treatise on the resurrection was written by Valentinus himself. Valentinus was a philosopher, a Christian philosopher who was active, first of all, in Egypt, and then moved on to Rome and established a school in Rome. If you read this little text in preparation for today, I'm sure you noticed that the treatise is a mixture of Orthodox and Gnostic ideas. First, let me identify the Orthodox ideas. Number one, the treatise is Jesus-centered. Jesus is the last word for all of us, the one that we should believe in and follow. Second, the doctrine of the two natures, that Jesus was both divine and human, is emphasized in this text. That also belongs to the Orthodox dimension. Third, there is an allusion to the transfiguration story from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9. And we will look at that a little bit later. Fourth, the author explicitly references the Apostle Paul, who is regarded as an authority. So all of that characterizes this text as Orthodox. But on the other hand, there are Gnostic elements. The clearest one is the author's belief in something called the pleroma. Now, can you, for just a minute, unmute yourself and say with me the Greek word pleroma? Pleroma, thank you. Pleroma means the divine fullness. So the author believes that above our world and surrounding our world is a realm of divine plenitude. And our little world is just an emanation. It's a part of the pleroma that fell down. We got stuck here on this muddy ball. So that's part of the Gnostic worldview, that human beings are sparks of light that fell down into the dark and muddy world. Second, the second Gnostic element is the author's repeated assertion that this world, our world, is an illusion. It's just an illusion. And finally, I would identify as clearly Gnostic the idea that the goal for Christians is to be released, to be set free from the elements of the material world and to go back to the light, back to the divine fullness. All right, let's now look at the text. The treatise begins with a contrast between those who are merely intellectually curious and those, on the other hand, who rest in the Word. So it's not enough just to be curious. Then the author contrasts the law of nature. Do you see that in the second paragraph? The law of nature is called death. This world, under the law of nature, is handed over to death. Then the Lord is affirmed to be both the Son of God and the Son of Man. If you look, Jesus embraced both humanity and divinity. Why? So that as the Son of God, he could vanquish death. And as the Son of Man, he could restore humanity to its original home, the pleroma, the divine fullness. Now, the author acknowledges that the theological concepts that he is using, in fact, philosophical concepts, are difficult to comprehend. But the author asserts that the coming of the Lord, who, notice, is called the solution. Do you see that in the little paragraph that begins, I know that I am presenting the solution in difficult terms? And then the next sentence, but since the solution appeared. So the point is that the coming of the solution brings about the destruction of evil and the revelation of truth. The world is then said to be perishing all around us. But the Lord Jesus, quote, gave us the way of immortality. Now, the Apostle Paul is then quoted. Do you see that in the paragraph that begins, the Savior swallowed up death? So midway through that paragraph, the author says, as the apostle said, we suffered with him and we arose with him. Now, that is a loose paraphrase of Philippians, a verse in Paul's letter to the Philippians. But the author has then added, and we went to heaven. We went to heaven with him. That's not found in Philippians, but that's the way Valentinus sees things. The resurrection is then declared to be spiritual. And the author affirms that faith is necessary to comprehend the resurrection. It's necessary even for a philosopher like Valentinus himself. The author then tries to reassure Reginus, who is probably a young convert, because he calls him at the beginning, my son, Reginus. The author tries to assure Reginus that just as he received flesh when he entered the world, so he will also receive flesh when he ascends, when he goes back to the source of life. Now, I think this is probably an echo of Paul's idea that we already examined in 1 Corinthians 15 of the spiritual body, the pneumatikon soma. Now, I want you to notice the striking statement a little bit lower down, if you can scroll down. The striking statement in the paragraph that begins, the afterbirth of the body is what? Old age. Well, those of us who, like me, have crossed the age 65 threshold, yeah, we may feel that way. The afterbirth of the body is old age, a striking sentence. But the author is trying to say that this old body will be given up when we depart. He explains to Reginus that there is no redemption to be found in this world. But those who have faith are intended by God to return to the all, that is, to the fullness of the divine. And now the question is posed directly. Can you look at the little paragraph that begins, "What then is the resurrection?" Now, in what follows, the author is going to present some poetic language, some images and symbols. Clearly, the author is trying to find language for something that is mysterious. So look how he begins. After the question, "What then is the resurrection?" the author answers, "It is always the disclosure of those who have arisen." And he offers as an example of what he has in mind the appearance of Elijah and Moses with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And he says, remember that Elijah and Moses, who had already been taken up to heaven, they appeared with Jesus in the Transfiguration. And if you remember that, you will know that the resurrection is not an illusion. It is true. The author then explains that it is our world that is an illusion. Here down on this earth, everything is given over to change. The rich become poor. Kings are thrown off of their thrones. The world is an illusion. But the resurrection does not have that character. The resurrection is, quote, the truth which stands firm. And I love the next phrase. It's in the paragraph that begins, "But the resurrection does not have this aforesaid character, for it is the truth which stands firm." And now look how it continues. "It is the revelation of what is and the transformation of things, and," I love this, "a transition into newness." You see, the author is at the edge of what he's able to describe. And so then he reaches out for a symbol. He says, the resurrection it's like light flowing down upon darkness and swallowing up the darkness. He recognizes that what he's offering is a symbol and an image of this mystery, but he hopes that it will do Reginus good to think about it in that way. So Reginus is then exhorted in terms of what kind of ethics, what kind of way of life should he live if he believes in this understanding of the resurrection? Reginus is exhorted to flee from conformity to the flesh, to flee from divisions, and to live as somebody who already has the true life of the resurrection. And practically speaking, the author says, adopt a way of life that is practices which are described as exercise, a kind of exercise that serves to release a person from the elements of the material world. And finally, the author closes by acknowledging that many other people are inquiring now into the meaning of the resurrection. Lots of people are interested. And don't be jealous, Reginus, of anyone in your group when he is able to help you understand it further. Okay, I find this to be a fascinating text. This mixture of Orthodox and Gnostic concepts. It's the way a philosopher tries to explain the resurrection. I think I am drawn toward the hypothesis that this is a writing of Valentinus himself. Not every philosopher agrees with, or not every scholar agrees with that, but several do. Okay, let me stop for a few minutes and see if there are questions. Questions, comments? I realize this may be the first time that you have read this text. And the language is a little bit flowery, right? It's not the straightforward language of the Bible. It's a philosopher's language. Yes, John.
Not believe in resurrection like apparently the upper class got these special tombs and so forth, stuff to take with them to the next life. Did the common people think they were just here and gone, or was this a new, or was it generally accepted among the Egyptian people that they all had some form of afterlife?
Yeah, your question is on the right track, and the way in which class, social class, and the intellectual advantages that come, right, from having leisure time to speculate about the meaning of the resurrection, the way in which that relates to the text that we just read. Have you all heard of a scholar at Princeton named Elaine Pagels?
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry, you've heard of her. I actually have a personal connection to her. I taught her daughter when I offered a few courses at Wittenberg. Larry, her daughter was a student.
Oh,
Yeah, at Wittenberg, and she took my classes. Well, Elaine Pagels wrote the best book, I think, on early Gnostic Christianity. She actually wrote two books. The first one called The Gnostic Gospels. She won a big prize for that book. And a second book called The Gnostic Paul. And what she says in that book, John, is that the Egyptian attitude that the upper class, the educated elite, were capable of comprehending the afterlife, that this attitude continued in early Egyptian Christianity. So she presents an argument that the Gnostics were, for the most part, educated people, upper class people? Thank you for that good question. Yes, please.
Here we're talking about the transfiguration where Moses and Elijah are standing there. How would I know or anybody know standing there that that's who they were unless they were introduced by someone?
That's such a good question. How would they know? I mean, that's already a question for readers of the Gospel of Mark. And Mark does not explain how they knew it was Moses and Elijah. Did Moses have the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments in his hand? Did Elijah have his staff, or was he riding in the chariot that took him up in the heavens? We just don't know. But the author of this treatise is not concerned about that. He simply asserts that the disciples saw Moses and Elijah. They saw them talking with Jesus on the mountain, and that is offered as proof of the reality of the resurrection. Okay, let's move on to the next text. Now, for the next text, I have to thank our colleague, our classmate, Mr. Beckman, because last week at the end of class, he took me aside and asked me if I was familiar with the Epistula Apostolorum, the Epistle of the Apostles. I read this text years ago, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to come back to it now. The Epistle of the Apostles presents itself as a letter by the 11 apostles. Why is it just 11? Because Judas committed suicide. And interestingly, at the beginning of the text, the 11 apostles are named. So they are the authors of this open letter to the Christian communities. The work has two parts. In the first 10 chapters, the authors give a description, that is a summary, of the key events in the life of Jesus. A kind of gospel narrative in miniature. And the second part then is in the form of a dialogue between the risen Jesus and the apostles. And that it's part of that dialogue that I have given to you now, the part that talks about the resurrection. Now, this text was originally written in Greek, and it also dates to the 2nd century. The Greek original does not survive. What we have is a Coptic version, which is generally regarded by scholars as being more faithful to the Greek original. And then we have an Ethiopic translation. So what I've given you here is the Coptic text. The epistle aims to uphold orthodox Christian teaching about Jesus in opposition to Gnosticism. In particular, the author is opposed to Docetism. Does anyone know what that means, Docetism? It's the idea that Jesus was not really in a human body. He only appeared or seemed to be in the flesh. He didn't really die on the cross. He only appeared to die. Now, that idea spread among the Gnostics, the intellectual, Christians because they couldn't reconcile the idea of a human body with the divine. So the humanity and divinity of Christ just could not be tightly brought together. Now, the author is opposed to the docetic understanding, and so the author of this text goes out of his way to affirm the reality both of the incarnation and of the resurrection. Now, what I find very creative here is that the author has appropriated the genre, the form of a post-resurrection dialogue between Jesus and the apostles. That genre, that form, was very popular among Gnostics. Several of the writings in the Gnostic library from Nag Hammadi take this form of a dialogue between the risen Jesus and the apostles. So the author of the Epistula Apostolorum has taken over, he has appropriated a form that was popular among the Gnostics and is now going to use it against the Gnostics to teach the physical nature of the resurrection. So, at the beginning of the text that I've given you here, the question is posed by the apostles: in what form is the resurrection body? Is it in the manner of angels, or is it also in the flesh? And Jesus answers by reminding the apostles that he himself put upon himself human flesh, in which he was born and crucified and arose. And the author claims that this was foretold by the prophets. Jesus then explains that just as God awakened him from the dead, in the same way the apostles will arise and they will be taken up into heaven. The flesh in which the apostles will experience resurrection is described as a garment that will not pass away. And now, if you scroll down to the bottom of the text, I want to read up a little more. Yeah, the beautifully lyrical last paragraph. And he said to us, "Truly I say to you, that I have received all power from my Father, that I may bring back those in darkness into light, and those in corruptibility into incorruptibility, and those in error into righteousness, and those in death into life, and those in captivity may be loosed, as what is impossible for human beings is possible for the Father." And now I love the conclusion of this. Look at it. "I am the hope of the hopeless, the helper of those who have no help, the treasure of those in need, the physician of the sick, the resurrection of the dead." So once again, we have here in the 2nd century evidence that Christians continued to ponder the meaning of the resurrection. Is it possible to imagine resurrection of the body, the transformation of the garment of our flesh. A garment, we will be given a new garment, the author says, a garment that will not pass away. Okay, again, let me pause and see if there are questions about this interesting little text.
Larry, I think that if you were told people, and regardless of what denomination, there would be a wide variety
Yes.
of understanding of what people think when they say in the creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body.
Yes.
I'm sure that as little kids, we might have asked mom or dad or grandpa, how big is heaven anyway?
Yes.
We hardly fit into the Sunday school room here of the church. How on earth, all the people who ever lived, how are they going to find a place? And then the parent had to struggle, well, it's going to be a different kind of body. Oh, a body that doesn't take up 3 dimensions, that doesn't grow old. Well, what age are you going to be? A little kid, or are you going to be, and so questions like that. And this helps a little bit, I think, for you to have raised up that this is a spiritual body. What was the term you used? A pneumatological body?
Yes, a pneumatikon soma, a spiritual body. Larry, you're absolutely right. What we have discovered so far this morning is that there was a diversity, right, among early Christians in terms of how the resurrection was to be understood. And it's because our thought, our language reaches its limit with the mystery, the ultimate mystery of the resurrection. I know.
I think a good thing for us to remember is we sort of think that the apostles had it all together. And we learn now with texts like this, there was a wide variety of speculation and understandings and going back and forth. And so we sort of think, gosh, couldn't we have the religion of the good old days when the doctrinal was so more settled? And now, but we should remember that it's never been completely one flesh, you might say. It's been a lot of
Larry, you're
understanding.
you're exactly right. The great German Lutheran scholar of early Christianity, Walter Bauer, the one who provided us with a Greek-English lexicon, he was equally famous for a book that he wrote called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Early Christianity. And Larry, what he demonstrated beyond doubt was that in the first 3 centuries of the Christian movement, there was wild, wonderful diversity. It is only in the 4th century, in those theological debates at the Council of Nicaea and the other councils, that something like orthodoxy was hammered out. And they got there only by excommunicating a bunch of people who could not sign on to the Nicene Creed. But it was Walter Bauer who demonstrated that what we have in the first 3 centuries is wonderful diversity, as the followers of Jesus were trying to understand the Christ event. Now, John, question.
Earlier in this, I had read the book, I read this thing. I was struck that Mary and Martha and Sarah, they named they didn't have any problem believing that Jesus was resurrected in the flesh, but the disciples, when it came to that, none of them would accept it, and all of them had to touch him too. And it wasn't just the one guy, but they all did. And
That's exactly right. Isn't that interesting?
yeah,
Isn't that interesting and so wonderful? And I think there must be something historical about that. I don't think the gospel, I mean, it's too embarrassing for the authors to have made it up, right? Yes, another question.
In the Bible, they talk about what does it take for a rich man to get into heaven? They talk about getting a camel through the eye of a needle. And I suggest, and I'm asking the question, does that suggest not necessarily earthly things, but things of faith that were spread among the people, and that it's the faith that we have that says we will be raised again? What is
Yes.
that's the story, because there's allegory all over the Bible, and that's allegory different than what we think of as earthly treasures.
Yes, thank you so much for that good point. I think you're right. And so I would say amen to the point that you are making. Now, with your permission, I would like to look at our third text for today, because in my personal opinion, this is the most beautiful of the three texts that we're going to look at. It's the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, chapter 11. The account of the death and resurrection of Lazarus. Scholars debate when the Gospel of John was written. Some scholars believe it is the last of the four Gospels. John A.T. Robinson from England argued that it was a very early gospel. And Rudolf Bultmann, my academic grandfather, argued that the Gospel of John is a complex writing that was edited a couple of times. In any case, we're going to focus on chapter 11, the raising of Lazarus. It is the pivotal episode in the Gospel of John. It is the incident that provoked the arrest of Jesus, according to the author of the fourth Gospel. It is the catalyst for the decision by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, to put Jesus to death. Now, can we scroll down to chapter 11, verses 45 to 53, toward the end of the handout? There you go, the plot to kill Jesus. Look what it says. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did when he raised Lazarus, they believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priest and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy our holy place and our nation." So the author of the fourth gospel believes that it was the resurrection of Lazarus that triggered the decision to arrest Jesus. But go back to the top of the handout. Let's go back to chapter 11, verses 7 through 16. Yeah, we're exactly at the right place. When Jesus announces that he is going to return to Judea because his dear friend Lazarus is sick. Look how the disciples respond to him. The disciples said to him, Lord, they say, Rabbi, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you're going there again? You see that? And then look at chapter 11, verse 16, where Thomas says, okay, let us go also, that we may die with him. So it is clear that the author of the fourth gospel believed that the resurrection of Lazarus was the action that Jesus took that led to his death. The second point I want to make is that the author of the fourth gospel understands the raising of Lazarus to be a sign. The Greek word is semeion. In other words, it is a symbolic action. In fact, the author of the fourth gospel believes that the raising of Lazarus is the greatest of the signs that Jesus did. Now, in the next chapter, which you don't have in front of you, so you just have to take my word for it, in chapter 12, verses 9 through 11, the author of the fourth gospel reports that, quote, the chief priest planned to put Lazarus to death along with Jesus, because it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting them and believing in Jesus. So even after Lazarus had been raised, the leaders of the Jews are planning to put him to death along with Jesus. And so it is clear that Lazarus' resurrection is only temporary. He is temporarily restored by Jesus to life, but he will eventually die again. Perhaps the chief priest will kill him. Perhaps he will die of natural causes. But Jesus' raising of Lazarus is regarded as a sign. A sign, how does a sign operate, class? A sign points beyond itself. It points to something else. And so now the question for us is this: to what does the sign point? Well, first, it anticipates Jesus' own resurrection. It foreshadows. In both cases, both Lazarus and Jesus, there is a tomb and a stone that must be rolled away. In both cases, there is the grief of the women and the disciples, and that grief is emphasized. In both accounts, the resurrection of Lazarus and the resurrection of Jesus, the grave clothes are singled out for mention, particularly the headcloth. So that's one thing that the resurrection of Lazarus points to in the Gospel of John. It foreshadows the resurrection of Jesus. Second, Mary and Martha, the two sisters of Lazarus. They are intended by the author of the fourth gospel to be representatives of Jesus' later followers, followers of Jesus at the time when the fourth gospel was written. In what way? It is because they are concerned, Mary and Martha, they are concerned about Jesus' delay in coming and his absence. And they're worried about what that delay and that absence implies for the death of those whom they love. Look at chapter 11, verse 21, and look at chapter 11, verse 32. First, Martha and then Mary say to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, this is intended by the author of the fourth gospel to speak to the concerns of his readers in the late first or the early second century, who were dealing with the delay of Jesus in returning and the implications of the absence of Jesus for their loved ones who had died. I want to also point out that Mary's weeping reflects the painful reality of the loss of a loved one. And the author of the fourth gospel does not conceal that. In fact, weeping in the face of death is clearly regarded by the author of the fourth gospel as appropriate. And that's clear because in chapter 11, verse 35, the author tells us that even Jesus wept. If you translate it literally, Jesus began to weep. It is the shortest verse in the Bible. Okay, finally, class, it is in the dialogue between Jesus and Martha, which is found in chapter 11, verses 21 to 27. So thank you for scrolling back up to that. Chapter 11, verses 21 to 27. Good. Thank you. That's what we want to focus on. It is in this dialogue that the meaning of the sign of the raising of Lazarus is explicitly discussed. Now, when Jesus attempts to assure Martha that her brother will rise again, Martha takes Jesus' words to refer to Lazarus' participation in the general resurrection that is coming at the end of time. Do you see that in chapter 11, verse 24? See, Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. So Martha's misunderstanding then leads Jesus to explain. And these are the crucial verses, verses 25 and 26. So beautiful. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, they will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. This is the ultimate meaning of the sign of the raising of Lazarus. Now, I want to ask you, class, to consider in conclusion the sense in which Jesus uses the words to live and to die in these verses. It is clear that something more than physical life and death is intended. And that is clear because Lazarus will die again later. No, Jesus is referring here to life and death in a higher spiritual sense. He is evoking an excess of life, an excess of life within life. And that is the question finally for us today. It is the question that Jesus asks Martha. Do you believe this? Do you believe in this excess of life? That is the question finally for all of us. Let me put it like this. Do we want the life that a relationship with Jesus brings? He is the resurrection and the life. Do we want that? To believe in him is to be swallowed up in a life of faithfulness. It is to continue his work with all of the dangers and all of the joys that involves. So the question for us here at the end of Lent, as we look forward to Easter, Jesus' question for us is simply this: do we say yes to the relationship with the one who is the resurrection and the life? Will we allow ourselves to be swallowed up by the excess of life within life that a relationship with Jesus brings? To be swallowed up in a life of faithfulness, to continue his work with all of the dangers and all of the joys. Do we say yes to that? Well, as you can tell, class, I find this chapter of the Gospel of John so beautiful and so meaningful that I have stopped teaching and gone to preaching. And I'm not ordained to do that. So I should stop and see if there are questions. I just hope that this beautiful text from the Gospel of John, I find John's answer to the question, what does the resurrection mean? I find his answer to be the most meaningful. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, will truly live. Well, thank you all so much for taking this journey together the past weeks. Once again, you're my favorite group. I love it. I will see one of you here in New York in a couple of weeks. And I'll see all of you in person for a new course at Epiphany in person after the middle of May.
Wonderful.
Oh, I'll see everybody on Easter Sunday when my family and I come to worship at Epiphany. Thank you so much.